Reproductive rights. Where this begins is with Margaret Sanger and Catherine McCormick. Both had been involved with women's rights activism since very early on, since the 1910s. McCormick had spent a great deal of her life taking care of her husband who had schizophrenia and supporting research in that. But after he died, she was looking for a new topic. She was one of the first two women to get a science degree at, I want to say Johns Hopkins, but I might have that wrong. But she was an early woman to get a science degree, and that helped her have an interest in what could be done using medication as a new form of contraceptives. Margaret Sanger, great campaigner for birth control, had wanted particularly something that was simple, that was female controlled, so you didn't have to ask your husband's permission to use it, or the man's permission at all to use it. You could use it. And preferably that was oral. She was someone who thought that pills were the way to go. She had her own pill addiction, which may have been part of that, but she saw that as the wave of the future. And basically what happens is Sanger pushes and coordinates, and McCormick gives lots of money. And the result is that they're able to get scientists to do the research, and they come up with the pill, which is what it was called basically from the beginning. When it's time to test the pill, it's first done at Worcester State Hospital, where they actually tested on some women with schizophrenia who were not given the chance to decide whether or not they were interested, and definitely were not having an opportunity to have sex with anybody that would make it useful. And then they move on and do larger testing in Puerto Rico, which they think will be a great place because it'll stay out of the papers, and it will be a place with a lot of interest. And it turns out that there is a lot of interest. A lot of women join the trials. A fair number drop out due to side effects, sometimes because the church disapproves, sometimes because their husband disapproves. And in fact, even though they're not getting attention from the mainland press, in Puerto Rico, the newspapers are doing a series of stories on them because they're very suspicious of why they're doing the tests in Puerto Rico rather than on the mainland, and why they're not testing it on Nordic Northerners instead. The FDA approves of the pill first for gynecological disorders in 1957. And so women immediately start getting it prescribed to them, officially for gynecological disorders, but in practical terms, they're taking it for contraception from the beginning. And then it is officially approved for contraception use in 1960. Who uses it? Overwhelmingly married women. Married women adore it, many of them. Lots of them use it. They see it as critical for the ability to control the number of children they're going to have. It's also something that they can use and still maintain an active sex life with their husband. So they see it as being beneficial in all sorts of ways. Also, one of the side effects is that it increases your breast size on many women because of the estrogen, and apparently that's very appealing too for a lot of women. Whether or not unmarried women are using it in this early time, it's not really clear. There's no decline in the number of women getting pregnant or the number of women getting abortions. So clearly there's not some massive change that unmarried women are suddenly using the pill and no longer having those problems. Part of it was probably because at this time, a lot of unmarried women might have, well, first of all, getting access to it would be hard because it was really only prescribed for married women. So you'd have to lie or deceive or find someone, a physician that was helpful. And then in addition, it was still a time period where a lot of women didn't really want to admit they were getting ready to have sex. And so they might put off actually trying to get effective birth control. Side effects. There were a number of side effects, particularly with the earliest pill, which has a very heavy dose of hormones. Weight gain, headaches, increase in breast size, blood clots, the really big one. And those blood clots could be fatal for some women, and were fatal for some women. Gridwald versus Connecticut, 1965, is critically important because it's the court case that goes to the Supreme Court, and it argues that Connecticut's law banning the prescription of birth control is a violation of the Constitution, and specifically it's made in terms of marital privacy, that there is the right to marital privacy. So birth control is legal and protected constitutionally for married people. But in fact, a lot of people sort of assume that includes unmarried people as well. There was a lot of hope for a while there that the Pope might decide to approve of the birth control pill as a natural form of birth control. One of the doctors involved was a devout Catholic, and he didn't see a problem with it. And there were other priests, members of the church, who thought that there was a good chance that it would be approved of. However, when it came down to it, the Pope issued Humanae Vitae in 1968, and that officially says that any form of birth control other than the rhythm method is a violation of church doctrine. The reality is, though, that Catholic women and Catholics in general, a large number of them do not follow this. And in fact, Catholic women use the pill at about the same rate as non-Catholic women. So there's this divide between what the church officially says and what people are actually doing. So we're going to switch from the pill. Oh, and then in 1972, we have a new Supreme Court case that actually covers unmarried people. If the right of privacy means anything, it is the right of the individual, married or single, to be free from unwarranted governmental intrusion into matters so fundamentally affecting a person as the decision whether to bear or beget a child. So that right to privacy, that right to make a decision, is not just something that is special to the marriage relation. It is instead something that belongs to the individual, whether married or single. And this, of course, is going to be a real step towards Roe v. Wade. Okay, we're going to switch now to discuss abortion from the pill. The legal standing in the 20th century, 1920s, 1930s, was that abortion was basically something that was prescribed by a doctor. And for the most part, it was assumed that doctors had the right to prescribe an abortion for a woman whenever it was therapeutic. And that medical exception really depended on the interpretation of the doctor. Some might interpret it that it would have to be a physical medical problem, but a lot of physicians interpreted it as also covering mental distress, economic problems, a variety of things. My grandmother had an abortion in 1938 or 1939 for that very reason. She had just had her second child. She was struggling. She actually had to seek inpatient treatment, and her doctor agreed that it was inappropriate or unhealthy for her to have another child at that point, and so she received an abortion. Now, she was white, middle class, living in suburbs outside of Detroit, all of which played an important role in her ability to get that. Midwives were also providing therapeutic abortion in this earlier period. The thing is, though, by the 1940s, increasingly abortions are moving from taking place in private doctors' practices or midwives' practices to taking place at hospitals. And the hospitals are concerned about this. They do not want to get a reputation for immoral behavior like providing abortions. They don't want to be seen as an abortion mill. They don't want to attract the attention from the Roman Catholic Church. They really do not. So what they do is they set up therapeutic hospital committees of doctors, and those doctors are in charge of deciding whether or not each proposed abortion that is brought before them is legitimate. And often they will set a certain number of abortions they're willing to do a year. Now, obviously, if you were white and middle class and had a family doctor who was willing to listen to you, that really helped you negotiate with the hospital committee. Even better if your doctor was a member of the hospital committee. But if you didn't, it was much harder to get an abortion by the 40s. And in fact, you have a growing awareness that the system is just not working. And so you have protests coming from psychiatrists who diagnose severe depression in women and are accustomed to using that as an indication for abortion and are having difficulty making that happen now. You have protest from lawyers who looked at it and believed that the abortion laws were out of date. There was a lot of concern from doctors who basically see this as an intervention in their ability to prescribe what their patients need. And often they're very aware of the high demand for abortion that is out there. And there's Protestant clergy who get involved too, because they believe that it's a choice for the individual to make, not for a hospital committee to make. So there's growing professional protest and concern about the abortion policies. It gets a lot of public attention, both due to an epidemic of rubella, which is one of the things you can now get a vaccine against. But rubella, the problem is children get rubella, but then their pregnant mothers get infected, and it often caused birth defects. And then thalidomide, which was a tranquilizer, I believe, or sleep aid, that was approved by European countries for use, but not approved by the United States. There was a doctor in the FDA who just held out and refused to approve it. It turns out that it caused significant birth deformities and in babies, missing limbs and things like that. And some women, for various reasons, got a hold of thalidomide and used it, not knowing about this. The one who gets a lot of attention is Sherry Finkbein. She was the local host for Romper Room, a kids show. And her husband had been traveling in Europe. He brought back thalidomide. She took it while she was pregnant. She became convinced that there was a real danger that her baby would be damaged and that she wanted an abortion. So she initially goes to her doctor. Her doctor goes to the hospital committee. It's looking like it's all going to be fine. But she gives an interview to the newspaper, and they claim it's going to be anonymous, but very quickly people figure out who it is. And as a result, there's a lot of publicity. The hospital committee basically feels that this is not a good thing. They try to get a judge to say they won't get sued no matter what happens. The judge refuses to do that. So it turns out they can't get the abortion there, and she ends up having to fly to Sweden to get the abortion she wanted. And this story gains a lot of public attention and sort of dramatizes the problems with the abortion system. How did it work in practical terms for a lot of women who didn't have access to the official therapeutic abortion system? You had to find alternatives. A lot of times it was by word of mouth. You know someone who knew someone who knew someone. Sometimes abortionists would actually send out recruiters to sort of let people know that there was someone they could go to for help. In some cases, women travel to Puerto Rico, Mexico, England, Sweden, Japan. Really varied where they were going. In some places, you could go and get a safe abortion, like Sweden. But if you went to Mexico, the clinics there varied very widely in terms of their safety. And a lot of times people went to illegal providers. And once again, same thing. Abortions were becoming safer in general because people understood the need for sterilization, keeping things sterile so there was no danger of infection, and also the use of antibiotics to protect against infection. So abortion was getting safer, but some providers just didn't care or didn't know and were completely unsafe. Others were good and made a career out of it and did a very safe job. But you were sort of risking each time. You hoped that the person who told you about this person was telling you the truth and something hadn't changed. The thing is, though, that all of those options required money. You have to have money to travel. You have to have money to pay for the abortion from an illegal provider. And you need to have contacts. A lot of women who don't have those things, poor women, African American women often, they don't have a lot of options. They can't afford the fees. They don't have the connections. And so they try aborting themselves by doing things like throwing themselves down the stairs, pounding on their bellies, taking toxic substances to try to bring an end to the pregnancy, piercing inside their uterus with a sharp implement. And sometimes what they're hoping is they'll get it far enough that they're bleeding and stuff, and so when they get rushed to the hospital will complete the abortion to protect their safety. The reality is that it sometimes works, but a lot of times it results in injury. A lot of women end up sterile, and a certain number of women end up dead as a result. And really, there's just this huge differential there, partially based on wealth, but also based on race. Women of color, according to some estimates, died of abortion-related complications almost 4 times as often as white women in these years. What begins to change things is you start having a feminist challenge, women actively arguing for abortion as a right, as something that they deserve, basing it on their feminist ethics. And there's a bunch of different groups involved in this. One of them is the Society for Human Abortion that was started by Pat McGinnis in California. And she basically rejected any kind of reform that the professionals might have recommended. She says abortion should be just another medical procedure. It should be affordable, and it should be accessible to all women. The Jane Collective actually starts out giving women referrals to an abortion provider, but they discover they can perform the abortions themselves. So the women involved are actually performing abortions, and they do a large number. The Jane women are two of them are up in the photo of the arrested women, and the black woman sitting there wasn't an immediate part of Jane, but what she did was she was brave enough to allow them to do abortions in her apartment, which was quite dangerous and illegal. And then the picture on the bottom left is Pat McGinnis. And then it sort of emerges into a general movement, which was arguing for free abortion on demand. Any woman should be able to make their own abortion decisions. All abortion laws should be banned. And they're increasingly arguing that as long as it's controlled by doctors, women will not be able to afford it. Poor women will not be able to afford it. They will not be able to get it when they want to. They'll be dependent on doctors' decisions about whether or not women should be able to get an abortion. And they've got some real logic there. Doctors in the 60s into the 70s still have very paternalist attitudes. And so you have this tendency for them to try to make decisions. So, for example, if you were a young white woman and you went to a doctor and said, I want to be sterilized, they generally wouldn't sterilize you because they would believe that you would change your mind later on. So they were very much feeling like they had the right to make decisions for women. So free abortion on demand, you have rallies, marches. One of the things that these movements do is they have speak outs where women stand up and talk about their abortions that they experienced. And that was something that had been really taboo before. You did not confess that you'd had an abortion, much less describe it. But these women would stand up and say, I had an abortion and this is what happened, and share that story with other women. And that was part of the activism. Then in 1973, we have Roe v. Wade, which is a Supreme Court decision that says the individual woman has a right to privacy, and thus the right to choose to have an abortion. However, abortion will still be controlled by physicians. It will be a medical procedure, and there will be a trimester timetable. So they're trying to balance between protection of the woman, protection of the embryo, and the right to privacy. And so they sort of say, first trimester, yes. Second trimester, maybe. Third trimester, no. So there's this trimester timetable that is set up. So it's not exactly free abortion on demand, but it's a lot closer. So what we're really seeing here is this debate over the right to choose. And a critical part of this is taking things that were seen as medical decisions, whether or not a woman should get contraception, whether or not a woman should get abortion, and turning that into a personal decision for the woman rather than the physician. This is justified by the Supreme Court developing this right to privacy that is nowhere actually written into the Constitution, but they argue that it's implied. They still depend on physicians to provide access to the pill, provide access to abortions, and that leaves problems of access. The pill costs money. It's a more expensive form of birth control, so it is generally taken by middle-class women who can afford it. Abortions cost money. And of course, you have the problem of access, which as the anti-abortion movement grows, they do their very best to shut down clinics and deny women access to it. So theoretically, you have the right to an abortion. Whether in practical terms you have a provider that you can get to within the proper time that you can afford, that's a different question. And here's lots of books